Wyoming Territory, June of 1878. The sun was just clearing the ridge above Powder River when the townsfolk of Rawbend turned their eyes away from the woman in the black dress stepping down from the eastbound coach. Brielle Alder wasn't surprised. She had stopped expecting kindness weeks ago, somewhere between the blood and the cold silence of the doctor's parlor back in Cheyenne. Her arms were empty, and everyone knew why. She walked with her chin up, though the weight in her chest threatened to pull her clear through the earth. The heat pressed on her skin as she crossed Main Street, her boots kicking up dust. She passed the Mercantile, where two women paused their sweeping to whisper. One of them, Mrs. Ellen Voss, had once brought her a pie when Brielle first married. Now her eyes slid away like Brielle was a ghost. She kept walking. The boarding house loomed ahead, paint peeling, porch slats creaking. It would do. She had a room there, paid for a month in advance with what little was left from her husband's ranch sale. Inside, the parlor smelled of old coffee and lemon floor oil. Mrs. Cora Mathies, the landlady, barely nodded at her. "You'll take your meals alone, Miss Alder," she said stiffly. "Some of the other ladies feel it's improper." Brielle said nothing. She only nodded and climbed the stairs with her trunk dragging behind her, the sound echoing like a coffin nail. She had not been in Rawbend 3 hours when the whispers started again. This time she heard them. "That's her, the one who lost the baby. Stillborn," they said. Some say it was a curse, or God's punishment. Brielle stood in the shadow of the post office awning, letters clutched in her hand, her jaw clenched tight. She had not cursed God. She had begged him, on her knees, until her voice cracked and her hands trembled from praying too hard. But none of that mattered out here. They only saw the belly that had once been round, and the way her hands were always curled like they still expected to hold something. She turned away from the post office, letters forgotten. That night, she walked out past town, out where the land opened into low hills and the air was cleaner. She needed space, needed to breathe without feeling like she was being watched. That was when she saw him. He was leaning against the fence of the Miller pasture, one boot propped, hat tipped back. A tall man, lean, with broad shoulders and the kind of stillness that came from working with animals more than people. His horse stood nearby, reins looped loose. He saw her coming, but he did not move. "You lost?" he asked, voice low, not unkind. "No," she said. "Just walking." His eyes lingered on her face, then dropped to her hands. He must have seen how they opened, then closed again. "You're the one folks been talking about," he said. She stiffened. "If you're here to pity me, don't bother." He looked straight at her. "Do not believe in pity. It is cheap and usually wrong." She blinked. He stepped forward, offered his hand like it was the most natural thing in the world. "Malden Zerrick." She stared at his hand, then slowly took it. "Brielle Alder, you come out here often?" he asked. "Only been in town a day, then you already figured it out." "What's that? People are small." She gave a soft laugh, surprised at herself. "Yes, they are," he studied her. "They say you're not a mother." Her heart twisted sharp. She turned away, ready to walk, but he stepped around her, not blocking, just being there. "You carried that child," he said. "You loved it. You planned its name, maybe sang to it when no one was around. That makes you a mother in my eyes. No one gets to take that from you." Her breath caught. She did not cry, but her hands shook, and when he reached for them, she let him take them in his calloused palms. "Why do you care?" she asked quietly. "Because I lost someone too," he replied. "A long time ago. Folks said it was not my place to grieve, that I had no claim. But pain does not listen to rules." They stood there in the dusk, wind tugging at her skirts, his presence like something solid and warm in the fading light. "You want to ride?" he asked after a moment. "I have not ridden in years." He smiled, soft. "Then it is due time." She hesitated, then nodded. By the time the moon rose, she was sitting behind him on his chestnut mare, arms around his waist, her cheek against his back. She did not speak. Neither did he, but her chest hurt less. Over the next week she saw him again. And again. At the edge of the pasture, by the creek where the wildflowers grew. Sometimes on the road when he was driving cattle north. He never asked her questions that scraped at her wounds. He let her talk when she wanted to, and when she did not, he just stayed near. One afternoon she brought him a jar of preserves. He took it like it was gold. "Never had peach this fine," he said. "I made it before I came," she replied. "Used to be good at canning." "You still are," he said, and something in her warmed. The town still stared, still whispered. But when she walked beside Malden, they kept their voices down. Maybe it was his height, maybe his quiet strength. Either way, she did not care. One evening, she found him by the old barn on the edge of his leased land. He was fixing a hinge. She brought a picnic cloth and bread. "Thought you might be hungry," she said. He looked at her, then at the food, then back at her. "I am always hungry around you," he said. She froze, bread forgotten. "What does that mean?" He stepped closer, gently brushed a loose strand of hair from her face. "It means you make this place feel like home again." Tears stung her eyes. "I do not have a home anymore." "You do now," he said, and she believed him. A late June storm rolled in from the west, dry lightning stuttering across the sky above Robin's low roofs and sparse cottonwoods. Dust lifted in sheets across the open fields, and the air carried that heavy hush that always came before rain. Brielle stood at the edge of the livery, brushing down the gray gelding Malden had let her ride 2 days earlier. The horse nickered softly, shifting under her touch. She liked the quiet of the stable, the warm hay scented dark, the simple rhythm of brush on hide. It gave her hands something to do, something steady. Malden stepped through the open doors, hat in hand, his shirt damp at the collar from the rising heat. He didn't speak at first, just leaned against a support beam and watched her finish. "You ride like someone who was taught careful," he said. "My uncle bred Morgans," she replied. "He taught me to sit straight, never pull on the bit unless I meant it." He nodded once. "Morgans'll school you quick if you're careless." She hung the brush, wiped her palms on her skirt. "You said you worked cattle near Fort Bridger once. Do you still?" "Not this season," he said. "I lease grazing land now east of the Sweetwater. Got 6 head of milch cows and a bull that likes to test fences." "You live alone out there?" He looked at her, slow and deliberate. "I do." She caught the weight in his tone. Not loneliness exactly, more like the kind of solitude he'd chosen but wasn't married to. "I used to imagine a house full of noise," she said, voice low. "Children, a dog, maybe a piano if we could afford it." He stepped closer, keeping his movements easy. "You still imagine it." "I try," she said. "But some days I can't even picture what my child's face would have looked like." Malden's hand tightened around his hat. "You don't have to picture it to know you loved them." She looked up. "Do you ever think about what you lost?" He didn't answer right away. Then quietly, "There was a woman once. I was younger, thought we'd marry. She left after her brother died in a mining collapse, said the land reminded her too much of grief. You ever write her one letter?" She never answered. They stood in the dimness, the storm pressing in outside until thunder cracked close enough to rattle the rafters. "You ought to stay till it passes," he said. She hesitated, then nodded. They sat on an overturned crate near the back wall, the wind whistling through the slats. She drew her legs close, fingers laced together in her lap. "I heard the school teacher's leaving," he said. "Her husband's been offered a post back east." "She never looked settled," Brielle murmured. "No." She never looked at the horizon either. "That's how you tell." She turned to him. "And how do I look?" "You look like someone who's been through fire," he said, "and isn't afraid of the smoke anymore." Her breath caught, but she didn't drop her gaze. Malden. Do you think it's foolish to still want a life after everything? No, he said simply. I think it's the bravest thing a person can do. The wind howled once more, and then the storm broke, thick rain drumming against the roof. He shifted closer, not touching her, but near enough she felt the warmth of him. I've been thinking, he said. That land I lease, it's good ground, plenty of space. I've been meaning to build something more permanent than a bunkhouse. She didn't answer, but her hand brushed his knee, a small, careful gesture. I'm not asking anything of you, he said. But if ever you wanted to be somewhere no one whispered your name behind your back, that place is mine to offer. The silence between them stretched, but it was a different kind this time. Not painful, just full. Finally, she said, I don't want to disappear. I want to belong somewhere again. He looked at her, eyes steady. Then let's build that, Brielle, you and me. She reached for his hand and he let her take it. His fingers were rough, hers still trembled sometimes, but they fit. The storm eased. The air smelled of wet earth and new beginnings. Neither of them moved to leave right away. They had time now. Real time. And something worth holding on to. By late July, the cottonwoods along the river had turned silver with dust, and the nights dropped cooler, carrying the scent of sage and creek water through the open window of Brielle's small room at the boarding house. She hadn't spoken to Mrs. Mathis in over a week, and the landlady no longer made eye contact when they crossed paths in the hallway. Brielle didn't mind. Her world had shifted, quietly, but entirely. Every afternoon, she left town on foot with a tin pail, pretending to gather berries or herbs along the edge of the Miller pasture. But what she gathered was time. Time with Malden under shade trees, beside the wind-worn fences, or in the half-finished cabin he was raising by hand. That morning, she'd brought him a bundle of muslin she'd hemmed herself. He was sawing boards when she arrived. I thought you could use some proper cloth for the windows, she said, holding it out. He set the saw aside and took the bundle, turning it over in his hands. You did these seams by lantern light. I didn't sleep much. He unfolded one. The stitches were tight, even. You've got a sure hand. Not always. He looked up then, something passing between them that didn't need naming. The cabin still had no floor, just hard, packed earth. The roof was half-shingled, and the walls bore gaps wide enough for wind to slip through. But it was taking shape, 4 corners and a ridge beam. A door hung straight. She moved to sit on the broad sill where the front window would go. You ever live in something you built yourself? She asked. Not with walls, he said, joining her. But I've slept under covers I stitched from rawhide, started with nothing when I left my father's place, not even a saddle. Where was that? North Texas, he said. He was a hard man. Never thought much of quiet sons. You were the youngest, only one, she nodded slowly. I was the oldest, but I always felt smaller than my brothers, like I needed more time to understand the world. You do understand it, he said. She glanced down at her hands. I understand how it can take things without asking. He didn't answer, but after a moment he reached into the breast pocket of his shirt and pulled out a folded scrap of paper. I've been meaning to show you something. She took it, unfolded it carefully. A pencil sketch, rough but tender, an outline of the cabin with wild plum trees penciled beside the porch. I never knew you could draw. Only when I care about what I'm drawing. She looked up. And those trees, thought we'd plant them together. She folded the drawing back, hands still. You're certain about me? I'm not guessing, he said. I've seen you carry sorrow without letting it harden you. I've watched you give more than most can manage with less to give. I want to build a life with someone who refuses to disappear. She set the drawing aside and looked out at the land. The sky was full of soft light, no clouds, just that endless stretch of blue that had always made her feel small before. Now it felt like a promise. "I'm not a girl anymore," she said. "My body—" "I don't want promises about children," he interrupted gently. "I want you. If we're given a child, we'll love that child. If not, we'll still be a family." Her throat caught. The words didn't come easy, but she forced them out. "I want to be your wife." He said nothing for a breath. Then he stood, reached into his coat folded over a post, and pulled out a small velvet pouch. She blinked. "Malden, I bought this 2 days ago," he said. "Didn't want to say anything until I was sure you were ready." He opened it. Inside was a plain gold band, worn at the edges but polished clean. Not new, but whole. "It was my mother's," he said. "She gave it to me before she passed, told me to wait for a woman with a strong back and a kind heart." Brielle reached out slowly. He placed it in her palm. "I can't promise I won't fall apart some days," she said. "Then I'll sit with you while you do," he replied. "And when I fall apart, you'll do the same." The ring slid onto her finger with a snug fit, like it had waited years to find its place. They stayed that way until the wind shifted and the shadows grew long behind the cabin walls. Neither moved to leave. That night, back in her room, she packed her trunk. Not with haste, but with care. She folded the muslin scraps, tucked away her sewing kit, and wrapped her mother's wooden spoon in a length of linen. When she reached for the small blanket she'd made during her pregnancy, her hands paused. She held it to her chest a long while before placing it gently on top. In the morning, she would wake early and walk the wagon road east. Malden would meet her where the cottonwoods bent low, and they'd ride out to the cabin together. There'd be work ahead. Floorboards to lay, a hearth to stone, a life to shape from what they had. But she had already known loss. What she hadn't known until now was how it felt to be chosen and cherished, not in spite of the ache she carried, but because of it. And that made all the difference. The land was still damp from last week's rain, and the scent of turned earth lingered as Brielle stepped barefoot onto the plank that would become their porch. Her skirts brushed the edge of a crate of nails, and she steadied herself on the doorframe, watching Malden work in the early light. He stood over a pile of split oak, measuring the length of each board by eye before setting them into place. His shirt sleeves were rolled to his elbows, and his hands, streaked with sawdust, moved with quiet certainty. She'd learned he didn't waste movement. Every small task was part of a larger rhythm he seemed to carry in his bones. "I've been thinking about where the stove should go," she said, her voice soft but clear. Malden glanced up, brushing his wrist across his brow. "You want the heat near the back wall. I want it where the morning comes in. I like the light when I cook." He nodded once, then bent to mark a spot along the sill beam. "We'll set the chimney line here then. I'll need to find someone out of Casper who can cut stone clean. I could write to my cousin in Laramie. She married a man in the quarry trade. You trust him. He built her a hearth that hasn't shifted through 4 winters." "That's trust enough." Malden straightened, stretching his shoulders with a quiet groan. "You always think 3 steps ahead. Only when I care what comes next." His eyes lingered on her face, then dropped to the callus forming on the edge of her thumb. "You ought to wear gloves when you sand. I like the feel of the wood bare." He said nothing more, just moved to the corner where the floor joists waited and began fitting them one by one. She joined him, kneeling beside the stack, and they worked without speaking for a spell, the wind threading through the open frame. When the sun had risen high enough to warm the clearing, they stopped to drink from the canteen she'd wrapped in a wet cloth and kept under the wagon bench. Malden leaned against the post that would hold their door, head tipped back. "There's a man in town looking to sell a Jersey cow," he said. "Calved steady last year. Might be worth the barter." Brielle handed him a strip of dried apple from the pouch at her waist. "What would you trade? Fence posts, maybe, or labor. He's been trying to repair his barn roof." She folded the cloth around the pouch again. "I can help with the posts. I've driven nails before." "I don't doubt it. But I won't have you on a ladder. Then I'll cut the rails." He gave a quiet huff, not disagreement, just acceptance. Silence settled in again. Comfortable. Familiar. Brielle's gaze drifted across the field beyond the cabin where the grass bent in slow waves. "There's a corner of the hill that stays dry year-round. I was thinking we could plant there." Malden followed her line of sight. "What kind of planting?" "Late squash. And maybe hollyhocks along the fence if we can get seed." "You want things that bloom." "I want reminders," she said. "That the ground can still give." He didn't reach for her. He didn't need to. The space between them held something sturdier than touch. A shared weight, carried evenly. After the sun dipped behind the ridge that evening, they stood together, lantern light flickering against the half-framed walls. Brielle traced the edge of the window frame with her fingers. "Tell me what you want in this place," she said. Malden took his time before answering. "I want mornings where we don't rush, where you hum without noticing. I want a fence that holds, a roof that doesn't leak, and a table long enough for whoever we welcome in. And if we're the only ones at that table, then it'll still be full." She turned toward him, her face lit gold by the lantern flame. "I used to think peace would come if I stood still long enough, but it never did." He stepped forward, not quickly, just sure. "Peace comes when you build something that can hold you." She nodded once, then laid her palm against his chest. "Then let's build it." He covered her hand with his. And with that, they stood in the quiet dusk of their own, making no watchers, no whispers, only the unfinished bones of a home and the promise of something lasting. The first frost settled in early that year, brushing the grass along the Sweetwater with white before dawn. The cabin, though still without its final coat of chinking, was warm from the hearthstone they'd finished laying in late August. Brielle stood beside the stove, stirring a kettle of parched corn and dried onion, the steam curling against her cheeks. Outside, Malden was splitting the last of the pine rounds, the steady rhythm of axe on wood like a heartbeat through the walls. She turned from the stove and reached for the crock of salt, her fingers lingering on the lid. The wedding lines had been said over a month ago, spoken beneath the cottonwood bend near the creek with only the wind and 2 witnesses from Casper, an older couple who'd raised 6 children and knew what vows meant after they stopped sounding like poetry. There had been no lace, no music, but Malden had taken her hand with a look that didn't waver, and she hadn't needed anything more. The door opened with a quiet creak, and he stepped inside, carrying the scent of split pine and cold air. He set the bundle of kindling near the hearth and pulled off his gloves, rubbing his hands together before crossing to her. "You going to keep that kettle for yourself?" he asked, leaning slightly to catch the steam. "That depends," she said, lifting her eyes to him. "Did you patch the east side of the coop like I asked?" He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a brown egg, setting it gently on the counter. "It's holding." She gave a soft huff, pleased. "Then you've earned your share." They ate together by the hearth, knees brushing, bowls balanced on their laps. The silence between them was easy, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the gentle scrape of spoons against tin. Afterward, he took her bowl and set both aside, then settled beside her again, looking toward the window where the last of the light pooled. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice low. "You do that often. This time it's about the barn. I want to build one come spring, with room for stock and a loft high enough to keep hay dry through winter." She shifted, folding her legs beneath her. "We'll need to trade for more nails." I've already started setting aside what I earn from the Tanner boy's colts." She studied him for a moment, then reached into the basket beside her chair and drew out a folded piece of paper. "I sent for seeds. They'll come with the next freight from Laramie." He unfolded the paper. "Beans, pole, and some late tobacco for barter. I thought we might hang it in the shed to dry." He ran a thumb along the edge of the page. "You keep thinking ahead. I keep us moving forward." He looked up from the paper, his gaze steady. "I never knew how much I needed that." She leaned into him, her weight resting easily against his side. "Then you were waiting on the right person." That night they lay in the bed frame he'd built from red oak, the mattress stuffed with wool and covered in a quilt she'd pieced from remnants she'd brought from Cheyenne. The wind pressed against the cabin walls, but inside was still. "I never thought I'd have this," she whispered, fingers tracing the curve of his shoulder. He turned toward her, voice thick with quiet. "I used to think peace was something you had to chase down. Turns out it just needed a place to land." She pressed a kiss beneath his jaw and settled into the crook of his arm. The winter passed slowly but without hardship. They traded milk and preserves to the Tanner family for extra firewood. When the river froze, Malden trapped for pelts and stitched new soles into both their boots. Brielle kept a jar of dried rose hips on the shelf, steeping them into tea that filled the cabin with brightness on dim mornings. They rarely went into town. There was no need. In the spring, the first shoots of squash pushed through the soil behind the cabin. The hollyhocks had taken root by the fence, just as she'd hoped. Malden built the barn with the help of the Tanner boy and 3 neighbors from farther west. Brielle cooked stew for them all, her hands sure, her laughter easy. By midsummer, the plum saplings had grown tall enough to hold a bit of shade. She sat beneath them one afternoon, sewing a small linen shirt, the stitches slow and even. Malden returned from the upper pasture and found her there, the fabric pooled in her lap. He crouched beside her, one hand on her knee. "You sure?" She looked at him, her eyes full. "The midwife says October." He pressed his forehead to hers, breath unsteady. They built a cradle together, not from a pattern, but from memory and care. Malden sanded each rail until the wood gleamed, and Brielle lined it with muslin. They placed it beside the hearth, where the warmth would reach it through the coldest months. When the child came, just after the first fall snow, the birth was long but steady. The midwife said little, only nodded when it was done and slipped out into the dark. Malden held their son first, his hands gentle despite their size. Brielle, pale but smiling, reached for them both. The baby's cry was strong, and it filled the cabin with something neither of them had words for. They named him Elias. In the years that followed, the cabin grew first a pantry, then a porch wide enough for drying herbs and rocking a child to sleep. The barn filled with stock, and the land gave more than it took. Neighbors came more often, drawn by Malden's quiet steadiness and Brielle's warmth. They were known not for what they'd lost, but for what they'd built. Each evening, Malden lit the lantern and Brielle rocked Elias, humming low. The wind still passed through the cottonwoods, but it no longer sounded lonely. And when the fire burned low and they lay side by side beneath the quilt she'd sewn with her own hands, Malden would reach for her, and she would rest her head against his chest, their child sleeping between them. They had found what they had once thought lost, and they kept it, always.